Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 106. Gordon Whittington, Editor-in-Chief, North American Whitetail. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
Hey, this is Jim Willems, president of the Pope and Young Club, and you're listening to my favorite deer hunting podcast ever, the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hello, my name is Merrill Sport. I'm president of the Hunt Channel, and you're about to listen to my favorite podcast, Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hey, everybody, this is Kirsten Godfrey, the Kentucky Huntress. You're up for another amazing podcast with Jay and Dusty on the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Welcome to the show. This is Jay Scott, your host of the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast. It's like that you're joining us again. It makes my day. And today we have a special.
Jay,
yeah.
Jay.
Yeah.
Are you there?
Red.
Yeah.
Red?
Hey, can you hear me?
Danny Red Defoe?
I made it, dude. I'm here.
But you're on the Up North Journal. What are you doing here?
I snuck away, dude.
Really?
I did. Can I be your co-host?
You know, it's a good fit right now because Dusty's on vacation. And I need a co-host tonight.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, Jay, can I please?
Did you ask Mike?
Shh. No, not at all. What do you want me? No, I'm not going to tell him.
Okay. All right.
He shuts my mic off anyways. I know you wouldn't do that to me, right?
No, I don't have that policy here at the Big Buck Studios. Absolutely not.
That's why I had to sneak away.
Okay. All right, Red. I'll take you up on your offer. Well,
sweet.
You're coming in at a very good time, but before we get to our guest, I'd like to remind everybody that you can pledge your support to this show by going to bigbuckregistry.com/pledge. All right, that's enough of that. Let's so tonight's guest, Red, and this is something special. This is one of those shows I've been thinking about doing for years. And
I caught a great night then.
You have. And I'm disappointed that Dusty can't be here to enjoy in this.
Dusty Schmusty.
Well, I can't say that. He's been with me since the day one, you know. But
Red's here.
But Red is here, and you're a great co-host. I mean, let's face it.
Thank you.
You know,
I try. At least I don't get my mic shut off, but I try.
I hope Mike understands what he's got over there.
I hope he does.
Well, let's hear tonight's guest, Gordon Whittington, who is the editor-in-chief of North American Whitetail magazine. Have you ever heard of? You must have heard of Gordon. I mean, everybody's at least read at least one of his articles over the years.
He's probably got so much deer hunting knowledge and stories wrapped up in his tip of his pinky than I would probably ever have in my lifetime.
Yeah, and he does and has been doing for 30 years what our goal is to do here on this show is to go get those great deer hunting stories in audio format, in the podcast format. He's been doing it in with his pen for years and years and years.
His pen, his typewriter, and I'm sure it's probably his computer now.
Now his computer and Facebook and social media. Yeah.
There's probably going to be some really good stories, so everybody better be paying attention.
I know I am. I'm going to be glued. I'll probably listen to it a dozen times after this. But let's get Gordon and let's see what he's doing today.
Sounds good.
Okay. Gordon Whittington, welcome to the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast. How are you, Gordon?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Doing quite well. Thank you for asking. Danny, how you doing over there?
Oh, man, I'm doing fantastic. I'm ready to go.
All right. Excellent. Gordon, I asked you to be on the show today because I can't think of too many people that have the resume that you do that would put you in the category of expert big deer storyteller. You probably have more, and you've probably forgotten about more big deer than I'll ever know about.
Well, I have been blessed, and that's truly the way I look at it. I have been blessed to have come along the right place, the right time, just when this trophy thing was gearing up, really, with whitetail deer. While they'd always been popular, it wasn't really until about the time I got out of college in the late 70s that people started to expand their horizons and think about scoring and become aware of giant deer. And part of that, obviously, was North American Whitetail itself. And I came aboard not long after it was actually founded in the early 80s. So I've been able to kind of put my surfboard up on top of that wave, and it's been a great wave, and ride it for a long way. And so I think some of that was just fortuitous in terms of timing and right guy, right place, right time. But, you know, I would say that it is, once in a while I think about it, you know, it's like if people could put their hands on the deer that I've, you know, even this week, I mean, the deer I've had my hands on this week are some of the greatest whitetails of all time. And that is truly a special privilege.
That's really amazing, especially to our audience, and to me in particular. That's one of the things that I have been chasing a little bit, are the stories behind the deer in an audio setting, and only audio setting. You've been able to write about this stuff for 30 something years. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's really, if you go back to the early 80s, I was writing some regional, you know, general outdoors content in my native Texas. And then when I moved over here in 84 to Georgia and went to work at the headquarters of North American Whitetail, I really shifted more heavily in what my greatest love was anyway, which is whitetail deer. And because I'd grown up on a ranch in Texas where, you know, I started deer hunting when I was 5 years old. I think I shot my first one when I was 7, sitting on my grandpa's knee in a ground blind out in the middle of an oat field. And my
Nice.
parents had a meat processing plant at the time that was, you know, most of the year they processed livestock, but during the fall they processed anywhere from 700 to 1,000 deer killed locally. And so I grew up in the middle of that as well. So I was kind of a deer guy without even maybe trying to be, but it was just always my love. And so it just worked out that way.
Well, it's good you loved it, because it sounded like you were inundated with it all around.
Yeah, that's a good problem to have. You know, if you're an outdoorsman, and I grew up at fishing and hunting and just doing everything outdoors. And to me, my talents, such as they are, led me in a direction of, I was never going to be an engineer. You know, I wasn't going to be a lot of things, but I did have some ability to work with words, and I had an interest in a kind of a passion for that. So being able to then build on that and turn that into a true career. And now I'm about to turn 60, and it's really all I've done since I got out of college.
So growing up with all this outdoors in mind, when you went to college, was that was your scope, was to head right for that field, or were you thinking of something else but ended up?
Well, I in high school I went to a very small high school. I'm one of 22 seniors in my senior class at Johnson City, Texas, in 1974. There were 22 of us, literally. So it's not like I had visions that I was going to go on and be the editor of Time magazine or something, but and frankly didn't want to. I just wanted to kind of just be able to take whatever my abilities were and be able to utilize them writing about things I enjoyed. And so I didn't know if it was going to be going into mainstream sports writing or outdoor writing, but as it turned out, I think it led me in the direction I really wanted to be. I mean, general sports writing is kind of a shark tank, and honestly, it's just, there's a grind to it. I've done enough of it to know that, I'd much rather write about deer than write about a football game.
Right.
Much more exciting.
Yep.
Yeah, I tell you, the thing about writing too that's different from television, and having spent a fair bit of time in front of a TV camera as well, the thing about writing is you can let your imagination roam, and it's up to you to paint the picture. But otherwise, but on television, you're doing some of that. But frankly, if your cameraman isn't doing his part, or if the conditions won't allow him to do his part, and frankly, part of that is the deer allowing him to do his part, then you're having a hard time telling the story you either feeling or that you want to tell. Whereas in print, you're starting out with a blank computer screen, just the way we used to start out 40 years ago with a blank piece of paper. And it's up to you to paint that picture, and you have the ability to do that in words, whereas sometimes it's extremely difficult in a visual medium.
Gotcha. Would you say that writing today is as important as it was 25 years ago?
Well, to me, honestly, I can understand why the question comes up, because there's a perception that if people are reading more today, it's only because they're reading what's on Facebook or what's in a text. Right. Or if they scroll across the bottom of a TV newscast or something. And maybe people are reading more than they ever were before, but it's not in a classic form that I grew up with. However, I would also say that, like at North American Whitetail, we have as big a readership as we've ever had, even, back in what many people would call the heyday, perhaps, of the trophy mania. And that just tells me that, the reader is still there. A lot of people have abandoned the reader because they're personally more interested in television or something of that nature. But frankly, the reader, the hardcore guy, still wants to read.
Gotcha. Okay. So when was the heyday of trophy bucks? Has it come and gone, or is it still around?
Well, if you look at the record book, one could argue that, as goes EHD or winter kill or coyote predation or whatever, maybe so go the prospects anymore. Whereas you would say back in the late 80s in Kansas, maybe in Illinois in the 90s, maybe Iowa even today, Saskatchewan back in the 90s, Texas obviously off and on, forever. There are places that are magical no matter what. It's just that, for instance, here in Georgia, where deer were basically extirpated back in the early 20th century, and they started bringing them in, and they didn't have many deer in the 40s and 50s and even 60s, but the deer they had, when you caught up with a mature buck, there were some great bucks here. They were northern genetics, well-fed deer, getting age on them. I mean, it was all the components that you need. Not as many ag crops, but well-fed deer, and there were some tremendous bucks killed here. But even by the time North American Whitetail had started in the early 80s, the heyday of the top end deer in the southeast was largely, going into the rearview mirror. However, it was really just getting cranked up in places like Kansas and today you'd say that, well, where is the frontier if there is one left? And I get that question once in a while. In fact, several days ago, we were discussing the Mel Johnson buck, obviously coming up 50 years. On October 29th will be 50 years since he shot, what is still the world record typical with a bow. And really hasn't been threatened that seriously that many times. You have a Zaff buck and you have some other deer that, by a scoring, judgment call or whatever, or broken point or something, didn't quite match him. But, nonetheless, there's been a lot of tremendous deer kill with a bow. But we're still looking at a deer from 1965 being, and still a top 5 all-time typical by any method. So that deer, at the time he was killed in Illinois in Peoria County back in 65, there weren't that many people bow hunting. Nobody had a compound bow. Nobody had a laser rangefinder. Nobody had trail cameras. There was a lot of things people didn't have. There weren't as many deer, but the deer had more age on them. And so, there's been kind of a trade-off back and forth. We're managing better, but we're also more effective killers now too. And so in some ways, maybe it's kind of an equilibrium there, but the well-managed places that have not had environmental issues such as EHD, drought, bad drought, something of that nature, I think frankly are still as good or can be as good as they ever were. It's just that, there's more competition now, urban sprawl. There's a lot of things going on that make it, challenging, if you will. But I think the potential for big deer is as great today as it ever was.
Interesting. Okay. Give us some of the backstory of North American Whitetail and how you ended up working for them.
Well, I worked at a magazine called Texas Sportsman in the early 1980s. I had been working a couple of years out of college. I had been doing some newspaper work in Texas. They started a magazine called Texas Sportsman, and it actually ended up being a monthly magazine that wasn't very big, but it did give me an entree into a company where the people knew the people who were about to found North American Whitetail. They hadn't founded it yet, but they were on the verge of it, and I didn't know that. And so I was working for them, and as a state hunting and fishing editor for Texas Sportsman magazine, and they purchased that magazine from the guy in Dallas who owned it independently, and brought it into the Game and Fish group in Georgia, which consisted of Georgia Sportsman, the Carolina Sportsman magazines. There were several that were building up a group of those. And I got in there early, and then as soon as I got there, they said, we're starting North American Whitetail. We just literally, here's the first copy of it. Well, the second issue of it, I wrote 2 articles for. And that was early 1983 that those were published. So really it just kind of morphed into that direction, not for any particular, master plan on my part. Really, I just knew that was a place that I didn't intend to leave Texas, but that was a great job in Georgia, and so I've been here ever since.
Gotcha. Now, how has North American Whitetail developed over the years? I mean, it started out as, it sounded like they put all the right components in place in the very beginning. And what was the launch of it? Did they just launch with a magazine and that was the basis for the whole foundation?
Well, what happened was that Steve Vaughn, David Morris, and a couple of other relatively minor partners who didn't really stay in the industry that long. One of them was an attorney, and one of them was a guy who'd sold advertising in the motorcycle industry. And they were all 4 partners from Atlanta. Steve and David, and of course David stayed very visible in the whitetail industry ever since. But they just personally said, we're really into these big whitetails. We don't know if anybody else is or not, frankly, but let's just put something together and find out. And part of the genesis of that, of course, was that they ran into Dick Idle. Right. Well, Dick was at the time, of course, and many current listeners here will probably say, "Who? That sounds like a stage name or something." But right. Richard Idle, that's his name, and from a North Carolina boy, and he in fact he played cornerback, I think, for North Carolina State, back in the day. And Dick's had a really interesting career as an antler collector, taxidermist, booking agent, now kind of a fashion interior designer almost for upscale, his high country sort of a rustic type furniture lines. And so he's done all these things since I've known him for 30 years now. But at the time he was really getting into collecting, whether it was the hole in the horn buck, whether it was some of these other great deer. He was really just one of the guys that was into that. And when he met these guys from the Atlanta area, and they said, wow, he's got all these photos, he knows of all these giant deer. These deer are bigger than anything we've ever seen. We're fascinated by them. We wonder if other people would be too. But they didn't know how many people like them existed. And they said, there's only one way to find out. We'll put out an issue of it. At the time they put out the first issue of North American Whitetail, David told me later, he said, I did not know if there would be a second issue of it because I didn't know if anybody would buy it.
Interesting.
Well, okay. It's laughable now to say that, but at the time that was all uncharted water. But of course they were already publishing state hunting and fishing magazines. They could fold it in as an experiment, get it on the newsstand and see what happened. Right. That was late 82. Well, truly, as they say, the rest is history because it was an overnight success and turned out to just start skyrocketing from there, and really was the first national title that really focused purely on big whitetails. I mean, deer and deer hunting had been around for several years, but they were a little bit of a different editorial slant. People like Texas Trophy Hunters Association, which more, a club type mentality and only covered a region. They were going from the mid 70s as well. I knew those guys when they started, but on a national scale to really focus purely on giant world class whitetails, it truly was North American Whitetail that started it.
Okay, gotcha. Gordon, go ahead.
So you tried to get you went for a home run ball, trying to get your little niche in this industry, and you ended up hitting a home run out of it.
Well, exactly. It was a bunt that ended up going over the fence. So
it was because the way you describe it, you're right. Deer and deer hunting was out there, but they're up Midwest, up by me, over in Wisconsin. They got and then you come out with this just a shot in the dark. Hey, let's throw this out there, and wow, that's awesome.
It took off.
Yeah.
And we still hear from people, of course, there are getting to be fewer of them because we're all getting long in the tooth, but I still hear from people that say, I have the first copy. And to a person, it's almost always guys, of course, not too many women were into it back then, but almost to a person, they say, when I saw that magazine on the rack, I remember seeing it. And that's 1982. And they remember seeing it on the rack and thinking, I'm going to get that. And they said, I've got them all since then. Or I've missed one or two, or I've lost them, or the dog ate them, or whatever, the house burned down or something. But they still got that first copy. And that truly does make you feel like, you can say, well, deer hunting's not very important. It's just a pastime. And frankly, that in one sense, that's what it is. However, it does make you feel like the caretaker of something a little more than that when people tell you that's been my favorite magazine for 30 years. And so you feel like I better not mess it up.
Right. That's a good point. Very good point. So Gordon, what's your setup like to write it? If you wanted to write an article, what do you do? Like, how do you decide to write one? Where do you set up? Do you shut the doors and lock the world out until it's done? Or how do you go about writing an article?
Well, this morning would be an interesting case in point. I woke up about 2:45, not because I went to bed early, but because I just woke up and I thought, I've got a lot to do today. And it suddenly occurred to me, I've got an idea for what my editorial in the September issue needs to be about. And it's not what I wrote about last week when I got it ready to turn in. I've now changed my mind. I'm going to start from scratch on a totally different topic. And so I sat down, and before it was daylight, I had my editorial for the September issue. But sometimes things just sort of, I don't know, as an editor's mentality is you're always looking for ideas. You're not so much executing them yourself as you are just trying to generate ideas that you think are, mean something to someone beside yourself. Otherwise, if you only put out a magazine for yourself, you'd better be very much like the average reader, or the magazine's going to dry up. But in my case, I'm always inquisitive about ideas and new angles and things that I haven't heard. And I still kind of take it like if that's interesting to me and it has to do with whitetail deer, I'm going to make the base level assumption on the front end that it would be interesting to a lot of our readers.
Okay.
Now, whether it's relevant or not, whether it's a regional sort of a topic that doesn't have a lot of legs to it. I mean, there's all kind of articles out there, and good, bad, and otherwise. But if I'm going to sit down and write one, I usually need it to be either a deer that's really under the radar, and I just honestly don't want to involve any more people than necessary in knowing about it until we print it. And there aren't very many of them anymore. As you know, everybody knows about everything now. It's all on Facebook. But
right.
But when you do find that special deer, sometime I'll say, I feel compelled to write this one, and I will. But it's not because I'm trying to save them for myself. Sometimes I just feel like that's the most expedient way for me to cover what I want done on that particular article. I don't write a lot of how-to. I guess I could, but I don't spend near as many hours in a tree as a lot of other guys do, and I don't pretend I'm as good a hunter as they are. I mean, you have to be out there a lot, and my situation's not such that I can be out there weeks and weeks and weeks every year anymore.
Right. So is it a process to, if you think it's interesting, do you sit down in front of your computer, grab a cup of coffee, bang it out, and then that's it? Or is there, how do you go about like getting the content that you want to put in there?
Generally, I will know what, the framework of an article has to be. And that, I guess you would say that's true of storyboarding a TV segment or any kind of content that has some structure to it. At some point there, you have to know at least kind of roughly what the highlights are of the outline or the points that you want to make sure you include. Whatever the facts are, the perspective quotes or anything from certain experts or people. Then at that point, I'm just looking for some kind of a mechanism to lead me through that story. And generally speaking, it's a hard thing to do. Some people are very good at music. I mean, I can play music all day long, but I'm not a musician.
Right.
I can make sounds, but I'm not good at it. I'll never be good at it. It's not where my talent lies. But I have more talent, at least relative to that, in trying to write and construct, words on paper by far than I do with music. Some people are totally the opposite. Some people say, well, I can't do either one. Some people say, hey, I'm gifted. I can do both. Well, for me, I just have to look for an idea that I think is kind of going to grab you and pull you into the story to start with. If it's a deer that's big enough, it's a Milo Hansen buck, it doesn't take much. Just get out of the way of the story and tell it.
Right.
Don't get yourself in the middle of it. People want to see the new world record typical. However, sometimes the deer is relatively, and I say only in a relative sense, the deer is, quote, ordinary by world-class deer standards. However, there's some real freaky story with it, and it's just one of those great classic hunting stories, or it's got some twists and turns to it, and so that you're sitting down there, you're trying to dump them into the article to start with, but you may end up massaging it heavily to get them into final form. And frequently, I mean, people think, well, how much do you edit people's work that they send into the magazine? My response, and it's honest, is I edit their stuff less than I edit mine.
Okay.
I'll rewrite mine 10 times. I might have to rewrite somebody's, story how to kill the state record buck because he's not a writer. But I can assure you, if I'm writing an article, I rework it more than mine than I do his. And so that's just the nature of feeling like there's always a better way to do it. You look at it and you say, well, that's not how I want to put it, or I should move this around or whatever. It's a little bit like, I guess it's like painting or anything else. You just, at some point, you just feel like, well, I'm not satisfied with it, but it's the best I can do under the circumstances, and then you move on.
Right. No, I get it.
And so it's really not anything more structured than that. And I know people write in different ways. Some people can sit down and just dump it into a file and have it pretty close to finish within an hour. And for me, I may work on it in bits and pieces for a month.
Okay. How do you end up finding your stories? Do you use social media to dig up the story first and then investigate and go deeper after the fact? And do you have to go deeper these days than you used to because there's all that superficial stuff on Facebook and YouTube about something that happened?
Well, it is interesting. I have actually found several people who have become good contributors for us, primarily writers, but in some cases photographers, because I am extremely active on Facebook. And that's also helped me to be visible in a way that people may say, well, I recognize that guy's name. He's with North American Whitetail. My cousin just found a giant set of sheds or something. And so when they have nothing more to invest than to hit the instant message button and shoot me a note and say, hey, you don't know me, but my cousin found a giant set of sheds. Well, sometimes that's literally where it comes from. Mm. And, I've said many times that from a deer guy's perspective in the media, I kind of still regret the day the internet was invented, because prior to that, some of us had already put the legwork in to develop the personal networks that allowed us to find out about the best stuff first.
Gotcha.
But that is progressively harder by the moment when, a deer can still be kicking in the back of some guy's truck in Illinois, and a kid in Bangladesh with a smartphone knows it. Right. I mean, literally. I mean, the deer's not even dead yet.
Right.
And so all of a sudden it's a free-for-all kind of a Shark Tank deal. But honestly, I've often said that, I didn't feel like we'd ever lost out on a breaking story that I really felt like was critical to have. And I think that's a blessing. We've been fortunate in that regard. And I suppose our reputation for, dealing with people well and presenting their deer with respect and hopefully having a positive, just overall feel to the stories that we publish. We're not looking to create controversy. We don't want a dark cloud hanging over a deer, because we're not going to grill a kid over, was it 30 or 31 minutes past sundown when he killed it. I'm assuming that if he didn't get a ticket and the kid acts like he's legit, or whoever he is, then as far as I know, it's not up to me to try to find something wrong with the deer. I mean, it's, I'm not going to suspect that every big deer is poached. I know there are people that have that attitude, but I'm just not one of them. And so I just treat people the way I would want to be treated when I'm talking to them about doing their stories. And we've been lucky to have some people say, I didn't want to do my article, but I'm comfortable with you. I can tell you want to do a good job with it, and so let's go ahead and do it. So I really do feel like that's something that we've tried to cultivate and hopefully live up to.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you think that the world needs a scoring system, or should it be more about the deer itself? Well,
the older I get, of course, the less hunting is about the score of the deer. because I'm convinced that scoring in some cases, it totally depends on the person. There are people who honestly do not care what their deer scores, whether it's a world record or a spike. I don't think it matters to them. That's not why they hunt. There are other people who their social, stature within a community, especially some rural communities still. And I say this having grown up as a ranch kid myself, it was a big deal if you'd kill the 10-point or nobody else in your class would kill anything bigger than a 9. So there's always that competitive ego aspect, I believe, to hunting and fishing, the stringer shot, who caught the big one, and frankly, unfortunately, all the cheating that comes with that, whether fishing tournaments with fish with sinkers in their belly or guys cheating and molding racks and trying to pass them off. And, so there is clearly that element still to it where people perceive of getting an advantage by having a higher number on a score sheet. That said, I think as the average age of our hunting population has increased, I think people have kind of gotten over, the antler craze a little bit. I'm not saying entirely, because they still would rather kill a big rack than have a smooth jawbone on a deer. I think that they still want to kill a trophy animal, but at the same time, more people are buying into the total experience, the growing the deer, the enjoyment, taking the kids hunting, videoing their hunts, just enjoying a piece of property with their family. I do think because of demographics and also just the life cycle of the trophy boom, if you will, that we are coming closer to an equilibrium there where it's not just a total antler mania like it was 20, 25 years ago.
Okay. That makes sense. All right. I'd like to talk about some of the bucks that you've been involved with over the years, Gordon, if that would be all right.
Sure.
And I think we'll just kind of reminisce a little bit here and pick your brain, and you can tell us what you know about these bucks more than if you haven't read the articles that you've written, or just maybe you haven't read an article on it yet, but we'd like to hear kind of what your experience was with that buck.
Sure.
One in particular I noticed, and I'm just on your fan page, I noticed that Pat Hogan is standing next to the hole in the horn buck from 1940. What's the story on that buck? I know the story, but I'd like to hear it from you.
There is a it seems like the longer it goes, after 75 years now, you would think that, well, there's surely everything's ever been turned up. It'll ever turn up on a deer. And yet, in some of these cases, because you don't really, you just have to go by bits and pieces and tidbits. The official story was always, obviously, the deer was, there wasn't any deer season of any type in Ohio at that time, 1940. Portage County, Northeast Ohio, the Ravenna Arsenal was just prior to World War II. They were building up the munitions in there, anticipating war, and there was a lot of activity in the arsenal. Train track right outside of it near the little town of Windham. One winter day, a bunch of guys are gathered around down there, and they're trying to figure out what's dead under the fence from the outside, with his head stuck under it, going toward the arsenal. And come to find out, it's this giant, incredible deer that some of the guys thought, well, it's an elk, it's a moose, we don't know what it is. But then another guy said, well, no, a guy named George Winters said, hey, no, that's a deer. He was a deer hunter from Pennsylvania, and he recognized that at least it was a deer, even though it wasn't like any deer he'd ever seen, but he knew it was a deer. And so after that, of course, the rack got mounted, went to no scoring system at the time, at least in the modern scoring system, and deer ended up in the old bar there in the social club in the town of Kent, a few miles away, and the Canadian club, and hung there for 40 years until Dick Idle, quote, discovered it. I think a couple of collectors had seen pictures of it and heard about it, but nobody thought it was as big as it was. And when he got there, he struck a deal to buy it, which is totally legal in Ohio to buy antlers. And after that, the whole thing blew up because the initial score on that deer was higher than the Missouri Monarch, which scored 333 and 7/8, but they got a score over 342 on the hole in the horn with his entry score, leading everyone to assume that, well, he is going to be the new world record. Now, he got knocked down to 328 and 2/8 when he went to panel several years later. And I know some of the guys that were on that panel in 1986, and they said, look, we scored him right. But there's other people that say, well, the guy who entry scored him still right, literally had written the most recent record book for Boone and Crockett. So how could you say Phil Wright was wrong? Thus began a long controversy, and many people still feel like, regardless of what they score, if both bucks walked out together, most people I talk to at least would say, I'd shoot the hole in the horn first. You could have the other one, I'd take him first, even though he's number 2 in the record book. Well, regardless, he's a giant deer. But then, of course, the hole in the, quote, horn on that right drop time has always been a subject of fascination and mystery and intrigue, because clearly it's not a natural hole. But we could never figure out exactly what caused it. And George Winters himself told me, this is in 1995, he's passed away since then, but I went to visit him after he retired to Florida. And he told me, he said, I'm telling you, he said, when we got to that deer lying dead under the fence, it was frozen into the ground, but when we started to try to pull him out from under there, the fence would move. And that some of that chain link fence, the piece of it that was straight on the end, that deer had jammed it through that antler, and that's where the hole came from.
Interesting.
So, does that make sense? Dick Idle and I talked about it after that, and I said, Dick, it's the best story I've got. I don't know. Everything else has been total speculation. 22 bullet, blah, 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 blah. Well, it doesn't look like a bullet hole. But he said, I can see maybe that could happen, drop time being relatively porous, giant-bodied deer, adrenaline, hit it hard, maybe just shoved, who knows? I mean, but that's what George said, and George was very clear-headed and still a sharp guy in his mid-70s at that time. Best information and as close to an eyewitness as we could find. So regardless of what caused the hole, it didn't affect scoring. It was not anything that broke off any antler or anything. It didn't affect how it was scored. But it did add a certain level of intrigue to that story that had he just been the old buck found dead by the railroad track, I don't know that he'd have had that mystique about him, but the hole in the horn is just a cool name.
Yeah, it's a great name.
It's a great name. And at the time, it was just like, they thought about, we're calling the railroad buck. Now, this is the guys at North American Whitetail and Dick and all of them trying to figure out what to call him, because they didn't have a name with him. We'll call him the railroad buck. Then they said, no, we'll call him the hole in the horn. Well, it's not a horn, it's an antler. Yeah, but hole in the antler sounds stupid. Hole in the horn sounds cool.
You need a couple of H sounds in the name.
Yeah, it's kind of an alliterative role there. So,
absolutely it is.
And just one of those things that as you look back on it now, it seems like, well, good grief, how could you not know that deer was going to be legendary and truly one of the handful of the most famous deer of all time, and perhaps most valuable deer of all time in terms of collector's value. And at the time, he was just a big smoke-covered deer head, 40 years old, hanging in a bar in Ohio.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Do you think people should collect antlers and mounts?
Well, here's the thing. I have never myself purchased an antler. Now, I have many friends that are devoted antler collectors, most of whom collect for their own purposes, not just so they can resell and make a few dollars. I mean, there's all types of people, as you know, from antiquers and everything else, people have different motivations. But if you say the alternative is for those old heads to just finally vanish and never be appreciated by the public, then absolutely I'm in favor of them at least ending up with somebody who's going to respect them and try to clean them up and get them scored and let other people enjoy them. To me, that's, the deer has paid the ultimate price for being shot. I mean, to me, the worst thing that can then happen is have a great deer that never sees light of day because somebody just they wanted to hoard the deer and the public never got to enjoy him. I mean, you could argue that public has no right to that deer because it's not their tag on it. And that's true. But I like the kind of attitude among people that's like, I just want other people to be able to enjoy the deer like I do.
Right.
And if I put him in a museum, if I donate him, if I sell him to this guy, he'll do him right. And so in that sense, where it doesn't contribute to the actual illegal procurement of the deer, poaching or whatever, then I honestly don't see how it hurts anything. In fact, it may help.
Right. I agree. I think it is important, and I'm fascinated with some of the specimens that people will collect, and I think it does. I think it helps us out in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and there's people that collect all sorts of things that are far more obscure to me than deer antlers are. I mean, there's one certain type of aspirin bottle from the 1870s. I mean, there's people that they have whole clubs that's devoted to that sort of stuff. I'm like, man, I'd rather collect antlers.
Right. No, I'm with you. I'm looking at another picture on your fan page on Facebook, and it's a fascinating picture. And it's the title is wrapping up a quick reunion with some close friends.
Yes, it is. Basically, I stood next to a bunch of deer heads lying on the floor after we shot some big buck profiles for TV, and I just, as best I could without tripping on an antler and impaling myself and breaking a valuable set of antlers, I just shot kind of a panoramic view with my iPhone, and it's kind of rough around the edges, but it does capture what I was seeing as I stood there in that room at Bass Pro Shops here recently, and just looked down, and there were 8 of the 9 heads that we profile were lying there, and again, some of the greatest heads of all time. Hole and Horn was one of them. The Mel Johnson, typical from Illinois, 1965. I mean, the world record Pope and Young. I mean, he's lying right there, 3 feet away from the Hole and Horn, and I'm standing between them, thinking, I've been blessed.
Right. What are the deer heads in this picture? I recognize a couple, but I want to see if I'm right.
Let's see. You got the Chris Tice would be on the far left end. That's a 279 and 1/8 Kansas rifle kill from, well, that was so long ago that Jim Shockey wrote the story for me. That's how long ago that was.
Wow. Holy smokes. That's crazy.
Jim used to write a fair bit for me in Whitetail. We go way back to before he was Jim Shockey, and
right.
And so way back in the day, like early 90s, I remember several articles he wrote for me. In fact, he wrote a humor series for me for several years under a pen name. And, he told me recently, he said, "Thanks for giving me my start as a humor writer." I'm not sure I served him well by doing that. I think he found his niche somewhere else, but nonetheless, back to the Chris Tice buck, that was a kid's first buck. He was in full velvet when he shot him in December rifle season. 1992 in northeast Kansas by a place called, appropriately enough, Stranger Creek. And there's no stranger deer, really, in some ways, than that deer. He's 279 with 40 scoreable points. They stripped the velvet off of him to score, and Boone and Crockett wouldn't take the score because they deemed him a cactus rack. And he most likely did have his antlers growing for more than a full cycle if you look at some of the antler formations. But he's quite a spectacular head. 40 scoreable is not something we see very often on a score sheet. There's just not a lot of 40 scoreable point deer.
That's crazy.
And Hole in the Horn has 45, and the Brady buck out of Texas has 47, I believe. But there are not many that will hit the 40 point mark for sure. The Chris Tice head does that, and 279 and 1/8 is within an inch or so, inch and a half of the Kansas record, were it accepted by Boone and Crockett. Regardless, he's a mega giant. There's no doubt about that. The kid's first deer, all the stuff you expect out of a giant deer.
Heck of a first deer.
There's no place to go but downhill after that.
What do you do after that?
But anyway, the Chris Tice is there. The Olaf Anderson head is in that photo. That's literally an 1886 non-typical out of North Dakota. That scores, I believe, he's in the high 230s. Tremendous head, still on the original mount from 1886.
Oh, wow.
You can believe that.
No kidding.
So he's and looks better than some 10-year-old mounts I've seen, but he's a great head, super heavy, dark, just cool because he's so old. And at the time, the guy that killed him was kind of a guy that he lived in Minnesota. He's born in Norway, lived in Minnesota, moved over there with his parents, then became kind of one of these guys that would go out west and acquire meat for the Army forts. No telling whether that was, I don't know whether that was actually buffalo or deer or elk or what it was. But anyway, on one of those trips out there into kind of west central North Dakota, he kills this deer. I think the place he killed it is now under Lake Sakakawea, which of course is a giant reservoir. So I don't think anybody be hunting that spot again unless they got a snorkel. But this guy killed the deer that in effect would have been the state record. Of course, there was no scoring back in 1886 or until 1950, but he was the de facto state record in North Dakota for like 82 years. So, pretty good buck. And the fact that he's on the original head to me is so cool. You just don't see that much on really old heads, you know. Other heads in there, the Doug Siebert's, the 244 out of Kansas with matching fork drop tines, kill with a bow. Just a great head, top 20, 25 head even now. He was killed, way back when, back in '87, I believe.
Yeah.
There's other heads like that. The Mel Johnson head, obviously 204 and 4/8, net typical Peoria County, Illinois, 1965 Pope and Young world record to this day. Let's see, what else is there? We've got the Hole in the Horn. We've got the Hill Gould head on the far right. That's that light colored antler, super palmated head.
Yeah, yeah.
Some circumferences. His fourth largest circumference is 9.5 inches. His fourth largest one. He's got 3 that are 11 to 13. So he literally does look like a moose. Killed 1910, way up in northern Maine, Washington County. 15, 16-year-old kid killed him and literally thought he'd shot a moose when he shot him back in the wilderness. Hunting with 2 other buddies the same age on a week-long canoe trip in 1910 in the middle of nowhere.
Wow. And
he shot this deer, and they brought it back. In fact, when he got back to camp, his buddies were back there, and he shot the deer, and it was close to dark. He said, could not believe it was a deer, but then he got to it, and he realized, it was a deer. He takes the heart and liver out, takes back to camp with him, puts them down in front of the campfire, and he says, what do you think about that? His buddies say, you shot a moose. He said, nope, it's a deer. Come to find out it was a deer.
Wow.
259, and he grosses a little over 270, but he's 259 even after, and he wasn't measured for 74 or 5 years after he was killed. So he was plenty dry by the time they measured him. And it's still 259 and still up to 13-inch circumferences on those palm main beams on both sides.
And that's a Maine buck from 1910?
Mm-hmm. 1910, yes.
From Maine. Okay, wow.
So, and of course there's other heads there too. I mean, the Don Roberts 1987, the high 230s, I think 239 even, Kansas buck. It's a mainframe 5x5, super, super massive. Some of these deer, if you say, well, here's, one of the deer we profile scored 239. Well, there's people out there that think, man, the Hole in the Horn's 328 and this deer is this and this deer is that, and 239, why did you profile one, quote, that small? Well, 239 is never going to be small. We know that.
Right.
It's still a world-class deer. But that particular 239 is super impressive in your hand. It's not just cause of antler density or anything. It's just some deer, when you get your hands on them, you're like, whoa, this is a deer. Now, that deer is that way. He's a 192 and change gross 5x5, but he sits up high. His tines are thick. We all know that's one of those features that you get nothing for on a score sheet. But boy, when you look at them and see them and hold them, like, whoa, this is a lot of bone here. And that deer is that way. Again, so score doesn't always reflect impressiveness, but 239 will never be small.
No.
If it is, I'd like to hunt where that's a small one. I'll put it that way. So there are all these heads, and you think about it, and you say, well, I've even told people, I say, if you were in one of these museums, like Bass Pro Shops, classic example, because they have the most big heads of anybody, and they're on public display, which is what's neat about it, and they're very good people for us. We work with them many times to try to help the public appreciate and enjoy these deer, and they're great to work with in that regard. So, I've often been asked, man, if you were in here and the fire alarm went off, and you didn't know how much time you had to get out of here,
right,
and it was up to you to save what you could in this collection, what would you grab first?
Yeah.
Now that's a fascinating question that I don't know the answer to, but I'd be hard pressed. I mean, you got the Breen, the Jordan, the Missouri. You don't have the Missouri Monarch. You got the replica of the Missouri Monarch in there, but you have the original Hole in the Horn. You've got many, many top end heads, and I guess I'd be hard pressed because the Hole in the Horn is the de facto mascot, if you will, of North American whitetail.
Okay.
And most associated with us. And again, he's 328. As far as I know, he's as big a deer as there has ever been wild. I'd be hard pressed not to grab him first.
Yep.
But I would do so with regret because of what I would be leaving behind.
Right.
As you can imagine, I mean, that's like saying, which one of your kids would you save if the house caught on fire and you had time to get one? You can't there's no way you can answer that.
It's a massively complex question.
It really is. And I don't mean to disparage human life by saying I'm going to compare deer antlers to kids' lives. I'm not doing that. But You know what I'm saying? There's certain
Absolutely.
questions that you just don't, you'll wrestle with a while, but you'll never be satisfied with your own answer.
Right. Never. Of all the articles that you've written over the years, do you have one or two that to this day are your favorites?
Well, there are some stories, not necessarily how I wrote them, but how I remember the circumstances being so freakish or unlikely, which is more the case, I guess. It's just unlikely the way that it turned out. And it was, and of course, in every case, we're talking about great deer. The one historic head that I would say I'm most proud of is when I finally found the first deer, the earliest deer in the record book, which is the Arthur Young typical out of northwestern Pennsylvania, shot in 1830. Now, this was a head so obscure. I mean, there's nothing else in Boone and Crockett, even Pacific walrus, elk, moose, grizzly bear, nothing that's as early as 1830. In fact, there's nothing else that I'm positive of that's pre-Civil War. But this head was 1830 up in the middle of the wilds of northwestern PA, and killed by a known hunter. And I'm like, well, I've never even seen a picture of it. I don't even know if I can find this head. No collector I knew, and believe me, the collectors, if it's out there, somebody generally knows something. This head had always been in the record book since 1965, so it didn't get scored for 135 years after it was killed, so I'm pretty sure it was dry too. And yet everybody said, well, we've heard of it. We looked at that line in there. It says 1830. We're thinking, man, what deer is that? But nobody could ever trace it. I finally traced it and got it in my hands. And a very private collector person didn't want to be identified. In fact, I've went to great trouble to keep from identifying the owner. Okay. But the cool thing is, cooler than the deer head, is the fact that I also held in my hand at the same time the gun it was killed with.
Wow.
In 1830, and Arthur Young's powder horn. I don't know if he had it on him at the time he shot the deer, but I have to presume he did, which has dates inscribed on it that were pre-Revolutionary War.
Oh.
Now, so when you have all that in front of you, you say, I finally gotten to this deer. And against all odds, I finally found it. Okay. And I've been given permission to write an article about it, just not identify anything and compromise it, but put one article out there for all time and let people appreciate, the first of the first deer, or the first of first anything Boone and Crockett. But to me, if you told me that, what of that stuff would you take if the house caught on fire? To me, I'm always got to get the powder horn before I get the antlers, and yet powder horns like that are relatively common compared to 1830 Boone and Crockett whitetails. That deer still ranks like number 10 or 12 in Pennsylvania after 180 something years. So, he's a good buck. But the most fascinating thing was to see the drawings and the etchings and everything on this powder horn and realize that predated the nation. And, so things like that will stick with you, and you'll never feel like you captured it adequately in type or in photos because it's just too overwhelming and cool a story. But stories like that I'm proud of. And the reason is I know how much effort it took to even find the deer. And if I hadn't found it, I'm convinced that the public would have never, ever known about it or seen it. And so that's things like that I'm really proud of.
That's fantastic. So how did you, as an investigative reporter, trying to figure out how the heck am I going to get to this buck? What steps did you have to do to figure that out?
Well, some of it comes down to I've at least got to, there was a name way back in old record books associated with the head, but it wasn't anybody named Young. It was somebody else, and the person was long since dead. And I poked around. There's where the internet helps, because eventually through enough different, just looking for certain names and dates and places and eventually in old newspaper archives, and eventually you kind of say, well, maybe it's here. I don't know this, but I'll go down this trail. And at some point, I finally made a connection with somebody who had many years ago known the person that was in the record book as listed as the owner. And again, been dead for many decades now. But I was able through passing a note, can you notify somebody you know that might still know somebody, and a long convoluted process. And it took years, but I finally found somebody who was responsive enough and just didn't just blow me off, you know. And they weren't the right person, but they passed it 2 or 3 links down the chain to where it ended up with the right person. So, you know, there's some things you just can't, you just have to hope it works out. And if it hadn't worked out, I would have still felt like I was obligated to search, because that an 1830 whitetail, you know, the earliest animal in the Boone Crockett record book, needs to have something said about it and done with it.
Heck yeah.
Even if that's the only time it ever sees light of day.
Oh, heck yeah, it does.
You know, so things like that, and it's a big deer. It's a 176-ish, thereabouts 6x6. You know, I mean, it's not like it's not like it's just a buck. I mean, it's a giant buck.
It's a giant.
And yet you hang it in a museum by itself, and people would walk past it to look at the 190s and the 200s and the 240s and stuff. But if they knew what it was, I think we'd all gravitate to it.
Right.
And if you put the gun and the powder horn with it,
yeah,
and the date, I think people would walk past the hole in the horn to look at it. At least I would.
Right. Until you get
I'm kind of into that, you know.
Yeah. The backstory to me and to you and guys like us is important, and it's almost like we do gravitate to the story more than the buck itself. I mean, the buck is great. Mm-hmm. I get that. But there's a story behind some of these deer that are as fascinating as the rack itself.
Yeah, if I were just to sit down and say, okay, here are the trails we followed, some good, some mostly bad, of course, but some of them have panned out. And over the years, and the people you get to know, and the places, it really is in many cases the people you get to know. I mean, I remember the moment the door opened and I met Milo Hansen, freezing to death in western Saskatchewan on an early December morning in 1993. I didn't even have, after finding out we could see him, I didn't even have time to go home and get clothes in Atlanta. 2 hours later, we were on a flight to Toronto and then to Saskatoon. The next morning, we were standing at the guy's doorstep.
Yeah.
And I'll remember walking in. He said, "Hey, here's the deer, eh?" And then we walked around to the right and got inside the farmhouse, and he opened the door there in the basement, and several of his buddies were there with him and said, "There he is, eh?" Well, of course, it's just a deer head, frozen deer head cape, fortunately.
Yeah.
But lying right there in the middle of the floor, and I was there 11 hours with Steve Vaughn, our publisher at the time. We went up there together, and I was there 11 hours. I never put a tape on the deer.
Oh, wow.
I never took one measurement on that deer because I didn't need to. You know, you look at it when, you know, as big as a Jordan is, obviously the giant, but when you're looking at 213 net, 213.5 net that goes over 220, and there's nothing on him that's debatable.
Right.
You know he's bigger than 206 and an eighth, which was Jordan.
Yeah.
You don't know by how much, but you don't really care because after 79 years, you're wanting a world record to pan out, and this one did.
Yeah.
But good grief, he's got electrical tape wrapped around that bright main beam where he shot a hole through it. There's a crack of light showing halfway into that main beam where he practically shot things like Antler off. Yeah. And of course, at that time, if you shot it off, too bad.
Right.
You know, now obviously they've amended the rule.
Right.
But good grief, I mean, when you find out he walks up and going to finish it off and shoots it and tries to shoot it in the head, you know, to kill it.
Right.
It wouldn't take much to mess up history if you were Milo Hansen under those circumstances, but because nobody had a clue what they were shooting at or even had after he killed it, you know, he left it hanging in his Quonset shed in his farm unlocked for a week after he killed it.
Right.
Out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't even think about locking the door on it. He didn't know what he had.
Milo was a fascinating interview of mine. We actually had him on the show. And
he's a super guy.
Super guy, super nice. It tells the story like it was 1993 all over again. And
yeah,
one of the elements or one of the pieces of the story that stuck out is how he said that he hadn't smoked in years, and the first thing he asked for after he killed it was a cigarette. He couldn't. His hands were shaking so bad that he couldn't even put it in his mouth.
Well, I even interviewed the kid who missed the deer a few days before.
Oh wow!
And he's an oil field worker, and he'd seen the deer and took a quick shot at it coming out of some bush or something there. And you're thinking, well, how history how everything about the history of what we're into is different by virtue of a twig, a wrong turn down a trail, 2 minutes after dark, all the kind of things that keep you from killing a big deer or let you kill a big deer. Mm-hmm. And you almost look at it as providence sometimes that this was meant to be the Milo Hansen buck. And where we've been so blessed, to be honest with you, Jay, is that we look around and I say, with almost no exceptions, I mean, there's a handful, but almost no exceptions, the biggest deer that we've covered and the people we've gotten to know have just been princes of guys. I mean, they really have it. Mike Beatty, there's no better guy on earth than Mike Beatty, mm-hmm. unless maybe it's Milo Hansen, you know? So you know, really, I mean, honestly, there's a level, it's just like it's meant to be, that the people that are going to end up being the true ambassadors, and neither one of these guys was exactly elderly when they shot their deer. Of course, Mike was just like 31. And of course, even Mel Johnson was a young man when he killed his world record. So, you know, you look at these guys and you say, for somebody that's going to be there in the public view, or at least known to be associated with a world record deer for a long time after they kill it, we have sure been, you know, fortunate the way it's worked out with the kind of people that have shot them. And for that, I mean, I count many of these people as truly good friends. I mean, I could, you know, at any time I'd do anything for them, and I believe they would for me, because we've kind of grown up together around these stories of theirs, and I kind of feel like they sense that we appreciate the deer and everything about them, that we really have a genuine love for what we do, and hopefully that comes through to everybody. But I'm particularly happy that it does, that I can call up Milo or Olive Hansen tomorrow and ask a favor, and they do it. And I haven't talked to Milo in a couple of years, probably, you know. Haven't talked to Olive in 20 years. Right. But they're just the kind of people that are that way. They're just good, regular folks. And so we have been blessed to have those kind of people as ambassadors of what we do.
Yeah, it is fascinating how that happens. Like, nice guys shoot big deer somehow. So that's
absolutely that story alone is just amazing. And then, like, you're right, it happens to good people. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there have been some people that I sense that maybe something changed a little bit when they realized, hey, this deer's worth how much? And then, but because of their life circumstances, I think they weren't bad people. It's just that they suddenly realized or perceived that, well, this is what my one chance to milk something for all I can. It's my one chance in life. And so maybe they get a little bit, you know, heavy-handed with how they approach the whole process, and sometimes they end up blowing it, because, you know, anymore, especially, the world's not going to be the path to your door just because you shot a nice buck. But some of these guys, you know, everybody's got a buddy that's an expert, and their buddy's telling them, hey man, you need to do this with your deer, don't do that, or you need to sell replicas, you need to do all this. Well, they just don't realize that what the market for their deer and images and all that stuff, it really is. It's just not what they perceive it to be. But I can understand why they dream of that. I mean, that's kind of a fantasy.
Right. That makes sense.
Exactly. And speaking of stories, we've talked about all these bucks, all these other people shooting a bucks. What about Gordon Whittington's favorite deer story? We've talked about everybody else. What about yourself? Well, you've got to have one story.
My favorite, you know, I guess most people would say, well, was it their first buck? Was it their first big buck? Was it their first doe? Whatever it was. I mean, I'm hard pressed to tell you that any deer mattered more to me than the deer, and maybe to this day, than the buck I shot when I was 13. This would have been, it was about 5:00 on December the 3rd, 1969. I'm pretty sure that was a Wednesday, and I know what I was wearing. Okay, so that's 45 years ago, 46 years ago now. But that deer was one, and this is 100, maybe a low 120s, 6x5 is what this deer is. On our ranch in Texas, where they have tiny little deer in the hill country, and yet, you know, I saw this deer in bow season in October, and I thought, man, I got to kill that deer. It's the biggest deer I've ever seen. Well, I hunted that deer for 6 weeks and killed him, and nobody was with me. I killed him by myself. I set up on him. I did all the process. And I'm not saying it was hard, because, I mean, you're hunting in hill country, Texas, and you're seeing deer all the time, but I just wasn't seeing him. But I finally shot him, and I don't think anybody could ever, to this day, be prouder of a deer they shot than I was of that one then. And even now when I look at that deer, obviously he's if I stick him in the middle of a bunch of other deer I've shot since then, well, he kind of gets lost. But my eye and really my heart goes to him, because that deer was the first individual deer I ever killed on purpose. And not the first, I'd shot an 8-pointer when I was 10, but, that deer was the one that really kind of like made me feel like, hey, I may be able to do this. I may be able to be a good hunter. And that in hand with my interest and passion for communication and language skills was, it just kind of dovetailed into place. And so would my life have been different if I'd never gotten that buck? I don't know. Maybe been better, but may have killed a bigger one. But I just know that I hunted that buck and killed him, and I just felt so much reinforcement out of that, if you will.
Right.
And I still consider that one of the greatest blessings of my hunting career is killing that buck. I don't care what anybody else thinks of him. That's truly moot. but I know what I think of him, and he's still as special as any deer to me.
Now that right there is awesome. You got to go way back. It just wasn't a couple years ago. It's a way back story. Now, the other question I have is, what is your favorite means of hunting?
I did not grow up a hardcore bow hunter the way so many people did when I'm going to say, quote, up north, but meaning, just the Great Lakes and Northeast and Midwestern regions where the gun hunting limitations were so extreme compared to bow hunting. We had kind of the opposite in Texas where I grew up. So I grew up rifle hunting even from the age of 5. I'm carrying my old Model 92, True Grit Special out there, and I'm hunting that way on foot, in open country. We had enough land that I could roam around. I didn't have to sit in one little cubby hole all the time, wait for a deer to walk by. I could get out and roam around and kind of feel like I was learning to hunt. So I've always been kind of partial. I love to bow hunt, but I don't look at a deer that I kill with a gun and say, golly, I wish I'd shot him with a bow. I know many people feel that way, and I don't blame them, but it doesn't matter that much to me. So I really like hunting wide open, rolling country that has some big deer somewhere out there, and I can just get out and go on foot. And if I got rattling horns with me and a spotting scope or whatever, and I can just get out and feel like I'm with Lewis and Clark and just go, and what I kill or don't kill is up to me. And that to me is the most fun hunting. Rattling in South Texas or Mexico, snow tracking. I mean, there's always ways, obviously, to kill deer. I've never hunted them with dogs, but I've had people tell me it's a lot of fun, just not for me. So I know there's reasons people hunt the way they hunt, and it's usually habitat related. Sometimes it's regulatory, but everybody kind of develops what they feel comfortable with and what they really enjoy. And for me, it's just big open country. And frankly, if I've got a rifle that'll kill one at 300 yards in a crosswind, well, I don't feel like I'm cheating. I know I'm still out there in the middle of nowhere trying to kill a big deer that doesn't want to be killed. And I just enjoy being out in wide open spaces.
That's just awesome. So, Gordon, do you still hunt with the Model 92 Winchester 3220?
I don't, and the only reason is that I went back in 1995 and killed another doe in the same field with the same rifle, and for all I know, it could have been another shell out of the same box that I killed my first one in 1963.
No kidding.
Okay. When I did that, now in Texas, the 3220 is still legal. As you know, it's really, good grief, it's almost like shooting a pellet gun. In the right light, you can see the bullet come out of the barrel. I mean, it's that slow.
Wow.
It's 1,200 feet a second or something, and a tiny little bullet. And frankly, it's just not. I mean, it is a sub minimal caliber for whitetail. However, it's still legal in Texas. And after I shot that one, I got to looking at the ballistics, and I thought, I think I'm going to put the gun up. Now, the gun itself was a few hundred serial numbers off from the one that John Wayne literally used in the original True Grit. Of course, he had the big hoop lever on his and fill your hand and blah blah blah. But mine was a little less celebrated perhaps than his. And we still have the gun. To me, you don't get rid of stuff like that. If the house burns down, is the only way you lose it. So
right, interesting, very interesting. Gordon, we've taken up over an hour, and I could listen to you talk about deer stories all night. And
Well, I enjoy telling them, as you can tell, hopefully, and I've got plenty more if you ever want to do it again.
I would love to do this again. In fact, there's so many. I mean, my head's spinning. There's so many deer that we could talk about that you've covered. That we could probably do a whole series, to be honest. But we'll let it go for tonight, and we'll come back and do this again another time because it was
sure
enjoyable for me, and I guarantee our listeners are going to love this as well. What do you think about that, Danny?
Oh, I definitely think they're going to enjoy this one.
Yeah, I'm going to listen to it over and over because I think it was really good. So, Gordon, thanks for joining us on the Big Buck Podcast.
Great.
Is that guy smooth or what?
Dude, that was phenomenal, I'll say. I mean, we over an hour of listening to him and his stories, and we finally got a story out of him about himself, and he went back all the way when he was 13 years old.
It's a great story. I mean, he has a great life story.
What about that? How the hole in the antler hole
in the horn buck, yeah,
got there. You know,
that's a detail that only somebody like Gordon would track down and get.
Or going back and finding the first deer, 1830s, holding it, yep. Holding the powder horn,
the musket, everything. So it comes down to that, and I agree with Gordon, is that, yes, we have all these amazing bucks. We see these antlers all over the place, and you go to any Bass Pro or Cabela's, and they've got the replicas hanging on the wall, and they're beautiful, and they capture your eyes. You're like, oh my God, they're gorgeous. They're gorgeous. But there's still an element of these less large bucks that have even better backstories than any of the bigger ones that are hanging on the wall. And they deserve as much recognition as any buck that's taken. I think any buck really has a story and deserves to be told. I mean, you're taking animal's life. It deserves a little something.
Absolutely. And to think that hole in the horn buck was sitting, or actually hanging, in a bar
right
for all those years, gathering smoke, dust, everything.
Right. Until
yeah,
Dick Idle came around and said, hey, I'll give you however much money you want for that.
Exactly. And you know what? And another good thing that I thought he said was about just collecting antlers, just to, people go out there and do it. They've got some do it to make knives handles out of and everything, but just to keep them in circulation and out there. Because really, some people get rid of them, but then again, some people, others, I kind of like the idea of just collecting them just to have, just so that they don't ever disappear.
Yeah. I think we should always commemorate any of these bucks and do what we do, really make replicas and spread the word and let people understand what the story is and where it came from and what it measured and all that kind of great stuff. And there's some stuff we didn't even get to talk to Gordon about, and because we did eat up our time, and I didn't want to go over, but there's so many other things that I need to ask him that I think is worthy of a second, third, fourth fish show. Maybe I should even just start their own podcast and really just produce that.
You really could.
You really could.
I mean, the stories could be endless, and it's amazing. And the way he tells them is awesome. It's just a great thing that people can listen to over and over again. And, hopefully there's somebody out there that'll, say, hey, and also the writing career that he has had. And hopefully, if somebody's inspired to do that as well, that they get involved. He's just an inspirational guy. So, and hopefully this show will bring some readers to his magazine, and hopefully some of the readers of his magazine will be tuned into our podcast over here. And of course to the Up North Journal podcast, which is where I stole you from tonight. Yes, you did. Yep. I snuck over here and Mike has no idea.
Right. And you're filling in for the incomparable Dusty Phillips, who's on vacation at the moment with his family up near you, from what I understand. And we're welcoming him back as soon as he gets back into town. So, but the show must go on, so we
must
do this. Exactly.
And I don't mind. So anytime you need a co-host, you just give me a call.
All right. And you're going to clear this with Mike, though, right? You're going to tell him that you did this.
Why?
Okay.
I like it here. It's comfy.
We treat you right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. You treat me with open mic.
Open mic.
As opposed to closed mic when I'm with him.
So does Mike have a button, like a on button sitting right next to him for your mic?
Yeah, he does it right on the switchboard. He just does it when I'm not looking and goes, oops, I guess I got to turn your mic on.
Oh,
you
wow.
think? Oh, I can't hear you that good. Gee, I wonder why.
It's because I forgot to turn you on. Oh, wait. I didn't even realize you were off, Red.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
but no, I thoroughly enjoyed listening to Gordon and being with you, and gladly sit in the co-host seat anytime.
Cool. I appreciate you filling in for Dusty. As you know, Dusty's an integral part of this show, and it's one of those spots. It's just always more interesting talking to somebody else than just talking to yourself. And I couldn't really think of anybody better than yourself to fill in while Dusty's away. So it's really a good blend, and I'm glad I met you face to face at the ATA, and we've formed this good partnership with everybody.
Absolutely. And you know what? That reminds me. Gordon will probably be at the ATA next year.
Yes, he will. In fact, that's where I met him the first time.
Exactly.
Yep.
So we'll have to hit him up again.
I agree. So, Red, where can we find you when you're not on the mic?
Oh, when I'm not on the mic, when I'm not on the mic with Mike.
When you're not on the mic with Mike, right?
Yeah. Head on over to the upnorthjournal.com. Check us out. Check out, we became friends at the ATA show, and now we got the outdoor podcast channel rocking and rolling. So, you can join us all over there.
Excellent. Well, you can join us in multiple locations on the Big Buck Registry. You can join us at bigbuckregistry.com. You can always give us a call at 724-613-2825. You can shoot me an email, jay@bigbuckregistry.com or dusty@bigbuckregistry.com. And maybe we'll get Red at bigbuckregistry.com if he comes back and does this multiple times. Just hint there, Red. If you'd like to share a big buck that you've shot with the world to about 150,000 plus followers, you can go to bigbuckregistry.com/mybuck, and you'll see all the instructions right there. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/bigbuckregistry, and Twitter, twitter.com/bigbuckregistry. And man, there's so many places we're at. I can't remember them all, but if you'd like to pledge with your show and the support for this show, you can go to bigbuckregistry.com/pledge. I think that's about it, Red.
That's awesome. We can find you anywhere, can't we?
Pretty much.
Yeah, just like the Up North Journal, but we're rocking it together. Being in the outdoors is a wonderful thing.
It is. It is a wonderful thing to get outside. I'm Jay Scott.
I'm Dan DeFaw.
And this is the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Deer Hunting Podcast. See you next week. Now, Dan, you say can't wait, because that's what Dusty says.
Oh, can't wait.